Do you think God stays in heaven because he too lives in fear of what he's created?
If you want to understand that joke, then buckle up, because this week we're talking about the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 and how the Trump administration is already using it to undermine the foundations of American democracy. What an episode. From Battle Born Progress, this is Battle Born Bytes. My name is Jacob. Let's ride. I won't bury the lead here. We're talking about the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, as you might already know, because that's the law that the Trump administration is using to deport people to an El Salvadoran super prison with functionally no due process. The White House has tried to say that these deportations were of gang members, but in the weeks since, they provided extremely little evidence that any of these people have actually committed crimes. Multiple courts, including the Supreme Court, have pressed the Trump administration to bring back at least one individual we know to have been mistakenly deported to this El Salvadoran prison. But the White House has been collectively dragging its feet, arguing that it's just too late to bring them back because now they're in sovereign Salvadoran hands. Wow, it's almost like some kind of process that would be due to someone before they accidentally get sent to a Central American hell prison would have been useful. Weird. We'll get into why this is such a mess in a minute, but first I wanted to explore some of the legal and historical framework for how this happened to put some of this in context. So let's go back to 1798. John Adams is the president number 2 for anyone keeping track at home, and he is increasingly unpopular, and the United States is on the brink of war with France. This is like peak French Revolution France, but pre-Napoleon. Actually, for anyone trying to win trivia, this is called the quasi-war because Congress never actually declared war on France, and it was mostly fought at sea. But for more on Napoleonic sea battles, I do recommend the documentary Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World. But I digress, because the key here is that Adams and the Federalists who control Congress are terrified that the French or other sympathetic immigrants could launch some information campaign against them. So, blaming European émigrés for being mean to them in the press, Congress passes and then Adams signs the Alien and Sedition Acts. These are 4 separate laws. They include the Sedition Act, which makes it much easier to prosecute people for being mean to Adams or Congress and the press. The Naturalization Act, which makes it harder to become a citizen. The Alien Friends Act, which makes it basically able for Adams to arbitrarily deport anyone he doesn't like. And the Alien Enemies Act, which allows the president to authorize the arrest, relocation, or deportation of any enemy alien during a time of war. Taken together, these 4 laws represent a fundamental erosion of the Bill of Rights, which guaranteed stuff like the 1st, 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments, right? All guaranteeing things like free speech and the rights to due process. But put yourself into the moment, right? This is 1798, just 10 years after the Constitution is ratified and the United States as we understand it exists. And now everyone in this country was reckoning with whether or not they were going to uphold the ideals of those founding documents. So it should go without saying that this was enormously unpopular. Thomas Jefferson, who was vice president at the time because of quirk of history, and also the leader of the opposition Democratic-Republican Party, well, he joins with James Madison to secretly draft opposition documents to the Alien and Sedition Acts called the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions. Those resolutions said point blank that these laws could threaten to tear the Republic apart. But the thing is, at the end of the day, this was a political problem with a political solution. In 1800, Adams and the Federalists get absolutely decimated during the election, and new President Thomas Jefferson and his Democratic-Republican Congress get rid of 3 out of the 4 laws from the Alien and Sedition Acts. The only one that's left standing? The Alien Enemies Act. In the century since, not including this year, it's only been invoked 3 times, each time with a declaration of war from Congress. That first time was in the War of 1812, when James Madison invokes the act in order to force British citizens to register with the US government, though it's not clear that anyone was actually deported over this one. But during World War I, the next time it was used, President Woodrow Wilson used the law to dramatically increase surveillance on German and German Austrians in America. In all, more than 10,000 people were arrested under the Alien Enemies Act, though most were paroled, and generally speaking, the worst that happened to these people was that they lost their jobs or were publicly humiliated. But things do unfortunately get worse, and that brings us to 1941 and World War II. That's when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signs 3 proclamations in the wake of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. This, under the Alien Enemies Act, lets the government arrest, secure, and deport Japanese, Italian, and Germans in the United States. But it also lays the groundwork for what comes next, Executive Order 9066, which authorizes the internment of Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were U.S. citizens, in concentration camps on American soil. This act, Japanese American internment, was an act of racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. But that's not me saying that. That's what Congress said in 1988 in an act signed by Ronald Reagan. So we know this now, but we knew it then too. In 1941, the Roosevelt administration commissioned something called the Munson Report, which was designed explicitly to probe loyalties to the United States among Japanese Americans. And you know what it found? American citizens were loyal to America. Weird how that works. So now we have to ask ourselves today, when the Alien Enemies Act is being invoked in 2025, the same questions that Thomas Jefferson was asking in 1798. What is the point of the Bill of Rights if the leaders we elect do not abide by its restrictions? Here, I'm just going to quote Thomas Jefferson directly. "It would be a dangerous delusion were a confidence in the men of our choice to silence our fears for the safety of our rights. Confidence is everywhere the parent of despotism." I tell you all of this background because I think it's important to be able to put what's happening today in the right context. Because each and every time the Alien Enemies Act has been invoked, it's been when Congress has declared war against a nation where the enemy is clear. So when the Trump administration uses the Alien Enemies Act to authorize the deportation of quote-unquote gang members without due process and without recourse if there's a mistake, we should recognize that for what it is. Completely unprecedented and almost certainly unconstitutional. Trump has tried to say that these gang members are quote-unquote invading the United States. But again, there's little to no evidence. And in the rush to create the theater of these deportations, the Trump administration has done what we've all expected them to do, and that's make mistakes. Of course, I'm talking about the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a Maryland man and Salvadoran national who the Trump administration admitted to mistakenly deporting to CICOT, the super prison built by Salvadoran President Bukele. The case against the White House in the courts is changing day by day over this case. But even the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that the Trump White House should facilitate Abrego Garcia's return to the United States. But the Trump administration has refused to budge and is now mounting a media campaign to try and paper over their own mistakes and invent justifications for their actions after the fact. In part, that's because of the weakness of the Supreme Court's order. Facilitate is, put simply, not a strong word. And in the void, the administration has tried to put up its hands and say it doesn't have the power to do anything, or worse, try and argue and doublespeak that actually the 9-0 ruling was in their favor when it wasn't. But if anyone can be deported without due process, legal experts are warning that even American citizens wouldn't be safe under this kind of regime. Trump has said explicitly that he wants to send U.S. citizens to El Salvador, and President Bukele has said that he's happy to help Trump do it. Hey everyone, Jacob from the future here with a little update, because over the weekend the Supreme Court actually stepped in again in an unsigned order issued extremely late Friday/early Saturday morning. The Supreme Court basically halted all deportations of Venezuelan men under the Alien Enemies Act until they say so. This latest move came because it was increasingly clear that the government was trying to deport people in a way that sidestepped the court's other orders that mandated due process, in essence by just deporting people so fast that they couldn't challenge the deportations. In this particular case, which is happening in Texas, lawyers for the ACLU have argued for at least 30 days of notice before someone is deported. But just to give you a sense of how tight the timelines here are, the Supreme Court actually issued this order again at about 1 a.m. East Coast time last Saturday morning. That's because of concerns that some of the litigants in this case were being prepped to be deported as late as Friday night. But just to put a bow on this, we can't really put a bow on this because we're still waiting from a full ruling from the Supreme Court and for this case to work its way through the lower courts. So for now, back to past me to wrap things up. On that note, I may as well end by quoting Thomas Jefferson, again in 1798. "In questions of powers, then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution." But that does it for today's episode of the show. If you like what you see, go ahead and like and subscribe so you're first to know when we upload a new episode. But until then, from Battle Born Progress, this has been Battle Born Bytes. My name is Jacob. We'll see you next time.